seminary at 14 to study for the Catholic priesthood and become a member of the Salesian order, an experience which has informed much of his writing. 7 years later, he left the religious order, worked as a coffee boy for the Boston Herald Traveler, as a taxi driver, and later as an assistant in the special education program, first special education program in the country. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Massachusetts in downtown Boston while on his 10th hitchhiking trip across the United States. In 1972, he settled in Port Townsend, Washington, where he worked for Olympic Reforestation, a tree planting collective. In 1976, he co-founded Empty Bowl Press and published several issues of Daley and the series, as well as numerous collections of poetry from the Pacific Northwest writers. Empty Bowl published his book, The Straits, in 1983. From 1988, he worked for both the Washington State Arts Commissioner's Poets in Schools program and Massachusetts Artists Collaborative. From 1984 to 2005, he published 6 chapbooks of poetry, as well as numerous poems and essays in national and local periodicals, anthologies, and on various web and blog sites. In 1990, he received a Master of Fine Art degree in creative writing from the University of Washington. In 2007, Pleasure Boat Studio published Way Out There, lyrical essays. He's been an English teacher at Mount Vernon High School in Mount Vernon, Washington since 1990. He lives at Lake McMurray with his wife, Kathy, and son, Theo. I hope this introduction did a service to him, and join me in welcoming this very interesting man, a lot to learn from, Michael Daley.
Thank you. This is like deja vu all over again. I have to rerun. I thought I would start by clearing up. That's not me with the beard. Most of my students said, Mr. Daley, are you on this guy? Is that you on that guy? Is that you with the beard? No. This is a man who at this time was 75 years old, and he was riding freight trains. He'd been riding freight trains since about 18, 16, something like that. He might have been 16 when he left his home because he turned the truck over. Maybe it was a horse cart, and spilled the milk. And the farmer was mad at him. And there was something about the farmer's wife, he told me, but so anyway, he got on the freight train. He got on the freight train, and he never looked back. And his name was, when we met him, first of all, he had a very thick Polish accent. And when we met him, he said, "My name is Larry." I said, "Larry? That doesn't seem right. That's not really your name, is it?" No, I just say that for the hobos, so that they know my real name is Laddie. And, oh, okay. So then that made sense. But he never stopped talking. He would have this thick accent, and he'd be telling us stories after story after story after story after story. And I'll read a little poem about him. On the freight train going through a tunnel, he was telling the story. Go through the tunnel, you can't hear anything. Come out the tunnel, he's still telling the story. That's the kind of guy he was. He was, I think, the most generous person I've ever seen in my life. The example I always think about with him was he was going around shedding himself. Whenever he had anything, he would give it away. He would never hold on to anything for more than an hour or two. He had an income. He'd have to go down to San Francisco to pick up a check every month or 6 weeks or whatever, and he'd do that, and then he started giving his money away to people. And he'd buy what he needed. He bought a new pair of shoes every month, and that was it. He didn't need more money. He'd just get back on the freight trains and keep going. So I found out that his real name was Ladisław Kukai. He was Polish. He was from a Polish community. He was American, but he grew up in a Polish community where everyone spoke with the same, apparently, the same very thick Polish accent as his. startling looking figure. He was the last person who saw him on a park bench, totally drunk in San Francisco. He must have been 93. Would have been 93. And he always said that he was the same age as Reagan. He was a lot smarter though. So, a little poem to start off. That the book kind of breaks up into 4 sections, each one beginning with a poem. And I don't remember which one that one was. Am I taking a minute? Okay. I left Portland on nothing but a breeze, afraid of jets, having lost my faith in air. I stood in a boxcar door, heading up Columbia Gorge, late moony light splintering the floor. My hands were rocks in a big green coat. Laddie rode the trains because he crashed a truck, the farmer's milk beside the white chickens. Story coupled to story, rattling through a tunnel and back out. He talked through the clash of steel and echo, no one following. His white beard floating the tilth of moon. In moon, a girl raised her hand as we were passing the garden and waved her baby's hand, a rapid pulse along my throat.
There is a ship, he tells me, travels across space playing Louis Armstrong for 50 years on a gold record. I want to be there, but where is space? Where is it?
His fingers curved the air. A year later, I found him in the public market with a cup out, singing little Polish tunes. Shoppers drifting past us. Small, dried flowers, purple and white, blew out of his pocket. 1931, the first night in the pit of the boxcar. Milwaukee, already asleep in his father's pasture. He cried for knit pillow feathers from geese he'd plucked. They can make a footprint for 100 windless years. He squeezes his fists, smooths some ground for a jug all day under the peach orchards. And into my pocket pours his cup of quarters. So when I started in the last period, I said I'll read this first story. It's an essay, a narrative essay, and it's about when I went to school in Ipswich, Massachusetts, at a place called Sacred Heart Juniorate, a junior seminary. And then I would like to read maybe a couple of smaller pieces, and I think if there's time, since there are so many people here, I think, who've read most of this book, or some of this book, if it's not too self-serving, I like to take requests. How's that? Okay, even parts. So this is called For the One Among Us Who Will Be the First to Die. New England's flaming trees seem preternaturally lit by mid-October. They glow that way only a short time. Boys in my school barely noticed, stopped rarely to save the leaf running with poppy and apple colors. Ice formed every night for a week. One of the brothers walked out on the pond each morning and held a ruler to the weakest edge. In my second year of high school, when I was the youngest of 35 seminarians, I learned to skate. The ice he approved glistened until the 15-minute break between classes. In ties, dirty jackets, pocked skin, and too short pants, we skidded on shoes that scuffed the smooth plate. It was 9 inches thick. I was fascinated by the clarity of the Miles River running below, branches submerged beneath my feet, leaves in the current fluttering hopelessly away from the chasm under the bridge. Deep, the eyes of fish bulged up at me. For those 15 minutes, everyone was kind, laughing or yelling over echoes clipped by metal trees. Some had sticks and pucks and dared one another to a quick game. Chasing someone to the far end near the bridge where the current was strong beneath the ice, I saw the miles twist through tufts and hassocks, frozen onto our flooded pond, a primal seeping under pitched voices. Then a boom over the ice. The whole solid piece rang. A 9-inch deep seam snapped across the pond, hair-thin fissures shooting from its sides. Charged with adrenaline, we ran, slipped, and leapt to the frozen banks. And then some quotes from Virgil here. All fall I struggled to learn to skate. Arma virumque cano troie, I recited, lugging the skates to the ice. Qualis apes, grunting, tightening the lacings. Quousque tandem abutere Catalina patientia nostra, as I fell, and fell again. And finally, after much care, began to slide slowly across the ice and forgot to brace for the fall, lifting one foot, then the other to push off and skate. During Christmas vacation, my uncle brought his niece from the other side of the family to our house. The adults left us alone on a pond and we skated all afternoon. For a student celebrant, an afternoon with a girl, even a cousin, was dangerous. I didn't dwell on the danger but spent the day with a coiled tingle behind the navel. After skating, we talked in the living room and I inhaled a particular scent for the first time. Her body gave it off. I was amazed. Foul like sweat, musty and wool, and some sweet drop I couldn't define or later rub from memory. She went on talking and she didn't smell how beautiful she was. Returning to the seminary after the holiday would have been more terrible had the pond not been frozen. For by this time my efforts were paying off. I was crazy about skating and I knew I might forget everything but that scent of hers if I skated hard on a cold wind. An expedition of skaters was headed up the miles. An all-day trek, grueling, freezing in the wind. We would expend our energies on the ice, and by evening, even those like me who still fell often would return as veteran skaters. The French Canadians were going. I was very impressed by them. They came to study with us, and some of them had little English, but more vitality than the rest of us, and an intensity which transformed them when they were at prayer into simpletons. Jean Lefebvre, with his red hair and gapped teeth, looked foolish in chapel piety, his small head in his hands rocking back and forth. Such a sinner. I wondered what his confessions were like. But on the ice, he couldn't wait, and skated with untied lacings dangling like wings from his ankles, assured and poised as always on ice, cajoling us slowpokes in his thick accent. While our little band located onto the ice and waited till everyone was ready, I stood at the fringe of a hockey scrimmage. The players had shoveled enough snow off to drag goalie nets. The seniors were practicing with Father Brown, an excellent skater. Jim Forrest was in the goal, and two other boys played defense against the priest. He swaggered onto the rink, laughing at them, till they took his challenge to play him 1 against 3. He was a man of purpose, I noticed, and like many Canadians, scrupulously unpretentious. He skated around them with the puck outmaneuvering like some odd ballerina, shin pads clattering in cold air, the echoing shish of skates and hockey sticks clapping over the pond. He wheeled the puck in and out of the defenders, teasing them before challenging the goal. Jim was covered by shoulder pads, shin guards, huge gloves, and a face mask. He eased out and placed himself squarely in front of the goal. Though bundled, he looked too fragile. When the priest skated very fast toward him, Jim swiped the ice but missed the puck. Father Brown prepared to deliver it into the goal when Forrest lurched to the right and set himself as an obstacle, which made the priest laugh before ramming him full force onto the ice. Then it was over, and he slid the puck in the empty goal. I was impressed. Jim didn't move for 3 minutes. I had never thought a priest capable of that, and I installed Father Brown in my chamber of idols. While some made sure Jim got up, the leaders of the skating party headed off. There had been snow and wind the night before, so we had to pick our way through rough ice. To leave the pond, we walked on skates up a trail to a small brick bridge where the road, punctuated by spiny birch, crossed the Miles River. I lagged behind to hobble up and crawl over the bridge without anyone looking. I crammed gravel into my knees and palms and slid down the embankment to the other side. But as I stepped onto the ice, someone shot out from under the bridge. Lefebvre had come behind me and hurled himself at top speed flat onto the ice and slid beneath the 3-foot clearance. Instantly, he jumped up, grinned at me, and ran on his skates to catch the group. I watched him weave in and out of mounds frozen to the body of the river. He tilted and veered between mound and weed patch. Icy wind had caught eddies the night before and kept them in a lumpy fabric. I watched him leap and kick one skate up like a rudder and lean his bare head into wind that clattered frozen cattails against one another. Way past his head, the dark forms of the others teetered like masts in a small regatta on twists of the flat river. Now I was alone. There was wind and the soft brush of dead weed, the scrape of my skates. I went leisurely and slowly, studying how the shape of my shadow lengthened and shortened as a man whose arms and feet could bend deliberately and evenly, fluid with care. A man of purpose. I brooded over the image. As a priest, that's what I would be, yet the image was appalling. A week ago, a girl was skating beside me, laughing in a unique way. Marie, my cousin. At the beginning, she'd said something I've heard only once or twice since, in bars or at parties. We were skating near small clusters of people on the bank, near a building. Someone fell on the ice and they joked to make him feel better. He was tall and wore a flamboyant scarf. His accent from the deep south would have been enough of an anomaly, but his skates were unusual too, black figure skates, the kind hardly anyone wore. No one at school anyway had anything but hockey skates, stout and scuffed. "What time of year is it?" they asked. He was holding the back of his head. He looked up at the sky and with a grimace said, "Yule," at which they all laughed. My cousin took my arm and led me back to skating. She said very seriously, "Tell me a lie." I looked at her, but her face was turned down at the ice. Then with a grin to cover what I might have taken as precociousness, she was a girl again. "I'm Al Capone's granddaughter." We both laughed. As much as I was a beginner with her, so was I in the spiritual life as well. My rites of puberty were superimposed on the spiritual exercises. As a way of purging our souls after the vacation, we immediately held a monthly exercise for a happy death. It was during my examination of conscience before confession that images of her came back strongest. The laughter, her smiles and jokes, remembering we actually held hands a few minutes, all this was most secret. I scoured my conscience for the bit that made sin, but kept losing the thread and stopped searching and knelt there in chapel, remembering. During the 2 days of the exercise for a happy death, I was permitted to speak with Father Cardillo. Although I had entered school only a few months earlier, he was already familiar with my abysmal moodiness. His office was a small cubicle near the main lobby. The frosted pane on the door held an etched image of the Sacred Heart, and you could look through either the heart itself or the thorns and dagger to see who was spilling his soul, who was crying, who was to be sent home. No one had given me so much attention when teenage depression haunted me. "What's wrong?" I fidgeted in the leather seat across from his desk. The face I made could have indicated I was less than comfortable. He continued to read his mail and question my soul. "I think I'm going crazy or something." For months, he'd been completing his psychology doctorate at Boston College. Tapping a silver letter opener against pale fingernails, he leaned back into the swivel chair. The squeaking and the short rolling sounds of the wheels signaled everything was all right now. We could talk. "Do you know who the president is?" His eyes went up in a funny way toward the ceiling. "Kennedy." "What year is this?" "What? Do you know when your birthday is?" He wasn't letting me be crazy today. "My cousin Marie," how strange I felt. I didn't commit a sin, and I couldn't stop remembering her. Why did I feel guilty? It may have been his silences I learned from, if I learned anything. 7 years later, I knocked on his door to say I had decided in the middle of the night, the last moment before renewing the vows, to leave the order because I could not be celibate. In all those years, his gestures indicated when he thought I was right or wrong. He was generous about Marie. There'd been a cousin in his early days, too, and she would have had me, he said, but her mother came along just in time. I tried to imagine the state of panic I would have felt. He didn't elaborate details, yet I could picture his young buck-toothed face wrinkled in distress, the cousin unfastening his clerical collar, an image I'm sure he didn't mean me to take. Look, try to understand what you're attracted to. Isn't it her body because its form is different from yours and everyone you know? Well, that sounds right. Well, is it breasts? Sure, breasts are lovely, we enjoy them. We love to touch them, they attract us. You know what breasts are for? It was several seconds before I realized he wanted an answer I presumed I couldn't give. Chagrined, I said they were for the baby. The baby, that's right. I don't have babies myself. Only the baby at Christmas, and every morning when I say Mass. Do you want that? Now, why do you think a girl's hips are wider than a boy's? But this was disappointing. He must have seen that. We can say Mass and breasts become breasts, hips, a bag of flesh. That is why we control our eyes, our ears, every thought. The problem you're having is of course common. You may always have it. Thoughts are hard to cleanse. Okay, this is the exercise for a happy death. Imagine, if you will, that every thought for the next few days might be your last. That's hard, isn't it? I know it is, but try. What would you want it to be, your last thought? The girl you skated with? By now, I was all but walking around tufts of grass. I'd already caught a blade under the skate and fell. My knees were sore and wet, and I was cold. I tried to concentrate. To become a man of purpose, I must get down the miles and come back a skater. The river lay before me like a desert, and the wind, though slight, flapped in my ears and froze the hairs of my nostrils. He could have gone harder on me. In private, he did not come off as severe as he did in public. The logic of his talk 2 nights before had run counter to my question, why am I tempted like this if called to be a priest? My cousin Marie, everything about him was wonderful and alien, could lure me from my vocation. Yet, he explained, if I have a vocation, the Blessed Mother will protect me. If I have a vocation and leave, I have broken a promise to her, and should I die, I might drop directly into hell. As my skates cut awkwardly the rough surface of the river, I felt sure I had a vocation. Reluctant to dismiss thoughts about Marie, I fell to wondering about my last thoughts before death, taking it as seriously as I could, bundled as I was against a cold that couldn't fail to make me feel alive. The penultimate prayer before the close of the exercise frightened me most, despite another sermon when Father Cardillo tried to witness his funeral. The prayer leader intones the title in the entire body of male voices, some deep, others croaking or high-pitched, rolls off the list of last particulars of the body's decay. The leader says, as if hoisting a beer stein, for the one among us who will be the first to die, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. Everybody chants to a hypnotic beat in a night chapel, like bushmen who might utter poetry to wonder if they always will be, except one among us could include the fallen and burning trees. As I moved over ice, this prayer coursed through my efforts to evade the memory of Marie, but as for my last thought, I couldn't envision it. My nose was dripping, and the little bit I gained on the skating party vanished when I calculated how far they were. Was that it then? A trance we were in? Did we know nothing, or did we learn to know nothing? Did we pray out of primitive fear, or did we understand our lives? Did we run toward the light or away from it? As much as I loved that priest, trusted and craved his counsel, I never told him about the brother who tried to rape me the year before I skated the miles. Back in Boston, I felt privileged to get to play table tennis after school. I realized what was happening only after he chased me around the table, caught me, and began to pull down my pants, tugging me onto his lap with the folds of his black cassock hid in erection. I was dizzy, straining my sense of reality against disbelief. This was a person I liked and trusted. Flying down the stairs while zipping up, I wondered what my mother was saying to my father at that moment. I disguised the event. It didn't happen. Yet for 20 years I have had a recurring dream. In a damp catacomb lit by weak lamps, a banner hangs above the door. Those who cannot fend for themselves must be placed on an altar. I am standing beside the altar, having carried a beautiful woman. Half the room is too dark to see. She is blonde and in a black gown with bare shoulders. I found her earlier that day in daylight, like a scene from La Dolce Vita, but in the most Marilyn Monroe style possible. We've made love somewhere on a wooden bench. She wanted to leave the park almost fainting with heat and the fear of oppressive eyes. I told her I'd take care of her, and she sank into my arms like a trusting child. The room is an alcove, a sanctuary. I am standing guard by her head. Doors open at the dark end of the room, and two disfigured people enter. "What do you have to say about this?" says the one in the lead. When he gets close enough, I see it is Father Cardillo. The man behind him is the brother pederast. They have misshapen heads. The priest is worse, a crater dent on the right side of his overly large forehead. His hair has thinned, and his eyes, always big, are magnified by the hollow around them. Blue veins on his face are the shape of a horrible insect. He is in the same black cassock which sweeps dirt like some deformed artisan's apron. The brother is his disciple. They rush toward me, toward the altar. I try and fail to scream, ready to fight. They are so ugly and menacing, they are ghouls. I have been expecting them. I must ask a question about love, and how will I be able to express it now? But my rage is so great, they flee by a door in the sacred wall which turns to light as they pass there. I heard the scraping of skates behind me and turned, surprised that someone was rushing up. Huge in his woolen coat, a scarf about his nose, and wearing sunglasses, George Stanton, a junior I didn't know well, skated awkwardly toward me, about to shatter my privacy. I was relieved I wouldn't have to think, but in a panic because we were going to speak, or else he might push me out of the way. His irregular strides scuffed the ice. His arms lurched out from his sides. He was getting closer, and there was no room to pass. When he was almost on top of me, he turned abruptly, annoyed to find me standing there, and skated through a thin mound toward a patch of open ice, where he plunged to his waist in the river. He looked ridiculous, sunglasses floating beside him, arms waving in all directions, angry at himself. His forehead creased. He looked into the chipped ice floating onto his coat and spread his hands out. He was standing on something. Then he leaned onto an ice block. It broke, and he fell forward. I didn't know what to do. He was the older boy. I hoped he would tell me, but he kept bobbing around in the water, flapping his arms higher above the ice each time. He was yelling words I couldn't understand, as if at himself. He appeared to want me not even to look at him. I lay on the ice, and my wool pants soaked through instantly. Holding the nearest clump of weed, I stretched my legs toward him. "Grab my skates! Grab my skates!" I yelled loud as I could over his splashing and cursing. But he lunged forward, as if he could get out of it by himself. The ice snapped again. I twisted around to get closer, mad now because he ignored me. "Grab the skate! Stanton! Stanton!" He paid attention at the sound of his name. "Grab the skate!" Finally he did, and his weight pulled on my ankles. I was afraid I wouldn't hold to the clump of weeds. "Pull yourself!" I called again and again, and I pulled too, getting my hand a little farther into the weeds. I started crawling more or less over the ice. When I looked back at him, he was straining, yet his eyes were incredibly alert. "Pull yourself! Pull! Pull!" I could feel him tugging all through my legs. He was very heavy. My clothes were frozen, my pants stuck. Finally, when his body was on thick ice, he jumped from the water as if propelled. I lay there, panting and sweating for just a second before I made Stanton flap his arms, then slapped at his legs and feet, yelling at him. He stared towards school at the hard ice as I slapped him and kept telling him how stupid he was until I got tired. When I stood in front of him to look for signs of shock, he was glaring at me. Then he turned and began awkwardly again, slowly, to skate in the direction of school. If he was embarrassed, I didn't know why. He appeared so dignified to me as I watched him make his way on iced weeds. He never looked back, lumbering from side to side as if hypnotized. Later, we would become friends. Two boys alienated from their schoolmates' more direct expressions of feeling, and who, much later, would shy away from those raw moments of outrage and love that friends and colleagues would succumb to in the face of global cruelty and arrogance. Over the wide river covered with snow, he was the only moving thing, dwindling into a small iced object on the horizon. He was almost at the bridge when I turned to look toward the farthest bend of ice at snow and wild, meaningless weeds. I couldn't go in either direction. I could barely see the others upriver. a world incapable of change. I was at the center of a large, floating avenue of deaths. Figures in the distance wore bright colors. Although they were going nowhere, they were dressed to dance. Now it so happens that the page I just opened up to has that poem that was up here. And since it was written here in Yakima, I'd like to read it. I don't know if it still applies, so maybe it does. It seems a desperate time of the year. Apples, the last, should have been picked, but for the unseasonable cold, unnatural frost. It comes after so long of penitent waiting. Through the cold, red cold apple the fingers touch. And just, you hope, the one person's from tree to you. But what happens there in the orchard takes many hands, many baskets to bushel, to grocer, to home. Theirs are the first fingers, having carried their bodies with so much care across our borders, to lift the apple from the branch. Opposite paradise, lost Eden, it is the one who first slunk across the border, so unlike that Adam who named and ate and then knew evil and fled the quintessential anger, the angerer, even while we carved the bright bloody groove of autonomy and distance into the human heart. It is the one who entered the garden fleeing the great wilderness of raw wounds, who picks our fruit. So, to lighten things up just a little bit, a short piece called How I Changed. I think everything that you would need to know to understand it is here, except those of you who are of another generation might not remember that there was a time when Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young did not get played on AM radio only. And they meant a lot at a certain point. Okay. Other references. It's a great movie I recommend called Midnight Cowboy, another one called Zabriskie Point. Strange, odd, old. And there was, for a short time, there was an actor, a French actor named Jean-Louis Trintignant, who I thought, definitely, that's who I'm going to be. So this is called How I Changed. And I felt it was an important thing to put in this book, starting with that event that I just read. Because I came out of the seminary when I was 21, having taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Right? Obedience meant that I didn't know how to think for myself. Chastity meant I didn't know anything about women. And poverty meant I didn't know how to get any money. So the logical thing I would do then is I decided to become a millionaire. This is what I will do. And at the age of 21, I figured, okay, I can probably make it by the time I'm 25. So I got a couple of jobs. I worked really hard around Boston. I got the right clothes, really good clothes. Bill Blass sports jackets and fancy. I tried to be as fancy as I could. I didn't have much money, but I knew that I was going to. I had all the confidence in the world. So I was heading in that direction. This is how I changed from that. Faulty memory makes good memoir. It was wooden ships, not 4 dead in Ohio. My worldview must have shifted prior to Kent State rather than later. It rehabilitates me. Not money made me see myself a creature driven and derided by vanity, but brutality in those deaths, close to home. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young at Boston Garden, and a flashy blazer, bright yellow tie, a beautiful woman, blonde, bouffant, regal for front row seats. Her ermine, her silks, her red dress, shoulders glossy under dizzying spotlights. I drove a freezer truck to Cape Cod's best restaurants, and in Boston, in suits, stood out front of major theaters directing folk lining up block for Midnight Cowboy, Zabriskie Point, and who knows what else now faded into the by and by, though I watched 100 times. When I got bored, I smoked. At a distance from other assistant managers, I preferred Jean-Louis Trintignant. I could just afford Boston Garden. I was the guy with the babe cold as luscious snow, hot as steel strings. Heads turned, jaws went slack. We were ushered to wooden seats not 10 feet from the stage by a white-haired man in white gloves. We were more the show than their mellifluous voices warning of a gentle lost future, which meant little, they sounded so good. And I was much the shiny dude down front with a voluptuous prize, a racetrack beauty, diva of cocktail parties, the future wife of Bath. Then the lights dimmed, the stage ready. Someone came for a sound check, a joke, or the introductions. We were in hardwood seats, yes, but in the direct shadow of the greatest singer, so no problem, really. The seats were worthy of extravagance. And just then, wooden ships, it must have been. How could I have known the events recorded in Fort Dead in Ohio and still strut about in such clothes and blondes of vanity? The lights went out and 20 or 30, perhaps 100, smoky, dirty, barefoot, big-haired people rushed to sit on the floor and fill in the front of the stage, the aisles, the front rows, and they squatted right beside me. Now, memory is conspiratorial, as was the cherubic smile of the person closest to me, a boy or a girl, with someone my age, dressed like the others, long greasy hair, and happy. They were all so damn happy. But my money was wasted. I turned from them to the glistening body beside me, and I didn't know who she was. Laughing and stretching out along the floor were the only people I ever wanted to know. Bunch of hippies. How much time do we have?
It's still 20 minutes. What time is it right now?
8:15.
8:12.
8:12. We got probably 15 minutes, right?
Okay. Those of you who are in the class, are there anything that you want to hear read in particular? I mean, I can go on and on, but I've read most of these aloud, so nothing's really new to me. So, if not,
I kind of like you just picking them.
oh, okay. Well, these are the rehearsed ones. See, that's what I was going to say. Okay.
I wrote a letter to Dan.
Okay, I'll read that. So, as Dan explained earlier, Mr. Peters explained earlier, we were both in an accident that, different accidents, of course, that were similar and left marks, I'm sure, on our lives that will last forever, as such things happen to so many people. And Dan got in touch with me and sent me his book. I think that I won't say anything about it because I wrote about it right here at the beginning, but it meant a great deal to me to receive that. And it took me a while to figure out how to respond. So in the it was in the accident that occurred to me happened in the process of writing this book, while I was writing the book. And in fact, I was in the middle of one of the other essays here and felt that I couldn't go on with that essay unless I made that also a part of that essay. But I didn't think that the letter I was writing to Dan was part of the book. It didn't seem right until sometime later, and then it became obvious that I had to put it in. So it's written in the form of a letter to Dan Peters. It was busier than usual here the day your book arrived. My mailbox was full, and so were the phone messages. A book from the poet Bill Yake, yours, plus the usual ream of crap in the mail. Good news on the phone, too. After a year-long fight with AT&T, they're calling off the dogs, admitting that $1,400 worth of roaming fees was, as I told them, due to a stolen phone and not me, the criminal genius, the little guy, the untrustworthy customer. Hooray for the unincorporated world. But I couldn't get to any of this or answer messages. Even got in trouble with my wife because I didn't pick up the phone. I had to read every word of your book as soon as I came in the door. You don't spend a lot of time describing the accident, but I recognize it's rippled through your life. That's been true for me. My 1-year anniversary made me fearful, not sure why. I drove the road for the first time in months and haven't since. A detail that struck me was you at 18 sitting down pulling grass. I've imagined this scene over and over. You, the grass, your hair, fingers, people not talking, bright sun, the terror a teenager must feel, wondering if it's what I felt. My reaction was to stand in the middle of the scene and try to find out as much as possible. I am reminded of my father taking my son and me, my 2 sisters and nieces, to a simple breakfast and a visit for an hour or so. He kept standing in the middle of the fast food joint asking people to hurry and get us our order, and asking each of us, did you get your orange juice? Do you have the donut you wanted? It annoyed me he couldn't let people behave as they're supposed to. He finally sat, too distraught to enjoy the minutes we had. I was standing like that, mouth open, asking everybody what happened, telling those who asked I didn't know how she got in front of my truck on a 50-mile-an-hour highway. My neighbor saw me and pulled over with the emergency vehicles and troopers arrived. Pulled over after the emergency vehicles and troopers arrived. As she approached, I said, I think I killed someone. She offered to call my wife on her phone, but we were so far in the sticks, nobody's cell phones worked. Before her relatives came running, I could not bend down to where she was, could not step across the ditch where she'd been thrown, or look anywhere but at her, or talk to her, her back to me, gray hair with twigs. I could not believe she was not going to move. I didn't hear her moan. I started shouting. I'm sorry, I can't read this. I've read it once in public, and it was pretty difficult. That I know I'm not going to be able to do this. I'll try. For those minutes, my terror was so great, I was certain she would stand up, get better, could not possibly be dead. These things didn't happen to me. I was not that person. My sense of unreality fought against the desire to ask if she was alive. When the people came out of her house, one was the older man I had admired weeks before sitting on his tractor in the field, one of my favorite meadows. He called her name with increasing alarm, and then something about the way he said her name made me guess he wasn't surprised, that he had thought someday she would be killed returning from the mailbox. That's what I wanted to think. Her niece held her, covered her up, and kept talking to her. I resisted asking if she was dead. A young man out from the nearby farm began to berate me. I don't see how, but stopped, recognizing the futility now of blame. Eventually, a woman with the EMT told me she died instantly. They were taking her to emergency, where they would tell the family. They insisted on leaving hope, but told me outright. All that afternoon, through interrogations with troopers, the accident report, a talk with a pastor, no one accused me. She was in the middle of the road where she shouldn't have been. It was a tragedy. How did I not see her? I don't know. I told them many times. I loved driving through that little valley, the eastern slope of the Cultus Range on one side, Cascade foothills on the other. Why didn't I notice a thin, gray-haired woman walking from her mailbox until I was 15 feet away? I stood on the brake with my full weight, unable to turn out of the lane and avoid her. All my life I have been the driver who just misses the deer or rabbit, even the child. When I got out of my truck in the middle of the road, I couldn't help but get back up or pick up her mail spread over the asphalt. My wife made arrangements for me to see a counselor. The counseling appointments were vital and continued a few weeks until I was out of the prolonged shock the counselor diagnosed. Then I gave it up. Helpful as the woman was, it was hard to get a word in edgewise. I never found someone else. Maybe my recovery, you used the word in a way I hadn't ever thought applied to me, Dan, got stalled somewhere in there. Although I've done all the other right things and kept my eye on my mental health all year long, I still feel an insight prompted by your book, as though I am one of the wounded. I can't re-enter life serene and content. I appreciate your willingness to show that in a poem. I can't help thinking that even with your compassionate eye towards students, you never fully let go of the boy who died. It is a kinship I feel reading your poetry, unluckily for us, a sad brotherhood. The counselor told me people would come forward to tell about accidents. You're the first. I'm grateful you let me know how we survive, and yet how we won't get over it. My father never got over his participation in the deaths of Japanese citizens during bombing missions. Right out of the military, he hired on with the post office, got up and did it every day, never complained, even when he worked a second job. Other things came out when he was drinking. Many times he had to be manager of the post office with a hangover. My mother used to send me to the corner saloon where I sat on the stoop below swinging doors until some uniformed guy asked Frank Daley to come to supper. One night my mother, my sister, and I huddled in the bed, door open to the kitchen, where he was throwing dishes, pots, and pans. The long kitchen knife twanged in the floor, linoleum turned up at its edges. Years later, he was throwing dinner plates around the room during the actual dinner. He never hit my mother or any of us. Returning sergeants like my dad were supposed to suck it up, work all day, have a few stiff belts before and after dinner, fight or fuck the wife and sleep it off. He was pretty much delayed and not recovering the rest of his life. Meaner and meaner those last years. He must have been in a lot of pain. His sour advice over the phone every couple of weeks, never get old, pal. Shoot yourself first, repeated to me, his only son and heir. On his deathbed 4 months ago, spoon-fed orange juice thick enough to get down without choking. He lost the ability to swallow. He asked the nurse almost childishly, "Should I excuse myself if I have to spit up?" We composed a letter to his doctor, also a military man, but he couldn't remember whether captain or major. And this kept us from sending the letter requesting a full examination of his entire body because he thought there was something wrong. We completed a 2-sentence letter to the doctor, and he was very proud. Showed it to his orange juice nurse. "This is very good," she said. "I thought so." He died the next day. In his last hours, all that was left of him was the squint with which he approached any problem. Bushy eyebrows knit together on each inhale. Exhales took sometimes a full minute or more. My sister left me alone with him, even though, as far as I knew, he couldn't hear me. But all I could do was cry like never before and tell him I couldn't live on my own. For many years, I talked things over with him in our weekly phone calls. That is, I would run things by him or ask advice. Less and less the last several years. I didn't tell him about the accident. I knew he'd worry, whether out of sympathy for how I felt, which I thought unlikely, or concern I might be arrested. I didn't tell him, and yet I wanted to know what he would have thought about the call I received 6 months after the newspaper carried a picture that didn't look like the woman whose face I'd seen in profile for a second, who had never seen me nor heard my truck. After I read her obituary 5 times, a lengthy one showing she was well loved and would be sorely missed, I was grateful to learn she had no children and was survived by cousins, nieces, and nephews. From hers I learned to write a suitable obituary for my father. I was struck to learn she was a member of our local land trust, active for many years. I made a donation in her name. The newsletter never printed the dedication from me, so her family never knew. I sent them a short letter of condolence and of course did not attend the funeral. The family never contacted me as my counselor had optimistically predicted. 6 months after the accident, a trooper interviewed me over the phone to tie up details. I was shaken back to severe depression when I hung up. After all this time, I had thought that even without a final report, I could adjust to and live with the memory. Although he spoke in a kindly way, he was determined to arraign me for vehicular homicide. I wasn't as upset about a trial as about the possibility I'd been driving negligently. I went out to the scene of the accident and drove the road again. Now every morning as I drive to work, I wonder if it was my fault. Another trooper said, "She's dead, you're the victim." A common formula to get drivers to fill out the report or admit guilt. Yet for all his cynicism, I'm consoled by it. If I'm a victim, it's of nothing but fate or misfortune. What if you or I had remained at school, Dan, to correct one more student essay or speak with a teacher just 1 minute more? She'd have crossed the street in safety, perhaps felt the breeze as I passed behind her. I've asked myself why I didn't take longer. Is there only one possibility for our deaths? Or do we miss so many until the law of averages catches up? The trooper did not believe in accidents, only causes and effects. An acknowledgement of fate would mean I was always to be the instrument of her death or accident, that ours was not a random encounter like wind tossing branches into the street. The notion of cause and effect must include your need and my need to be somewhere else, our pressure to move with the clock from one occupation to another, too busy to pull over and admire the way tall grass swayed in her pasture. When I left the room where my father died, he was every man. The pinch in his eyebrows gone, mouth open, empty, cheeks hollow, his skin yellow, white hair all gone, all but gone, though he had a haircut and shaved that afternoon. We closed his eyes, his head on the pillow. He'd been facing the ceiling all those hours, slowly finding his last breath. He was no longer there, his body a husk. Immediately after the accident, the vet told me our cat had a rare, inoperable cancer in his nasal passage. I decided on chemotherapy and forced pills into him. Though I kept thinking I should be taking more care of myself than this cat, it was for my son. Many nights he had to face the death of his pet and couldn't comprehend its irrationality, how undeserving of death the cat was. He knew nothing of the accident I'd been in. We never talked about it. All I could do was console him over his pending loss. In the middle of the night, when I could see nothing but the torments of an unforgiven life, the cat would have trouble breathing or my son would awaken in tears. Not until the first anniversary passed and after my father died did I find I could be of use intentionally instead of as a simple shuffling figure of duty and routine. By the second or third dream, I had a sense of relief. He pulled up outside a hospital. I was in the bed there. He was driving a '57 Chevy, green and white. In a small, loose, happy crowd of people storming the building, he walked buoyantly across the bright snow field to get to my room. The woman I'd only seen in profile in knit sweater fluttering past, headed toward another room. He wore an odd hat with ear flaps like the one in a news photo when he graduated from gunnery school in 1942, coming into the room from sunshine with the widest smile I had ever seen. The smile he used to have when I was a kid, one I hadn't seen in so long, though 11 years of cancer made his humor the more sardonic. A beatific smile, lips stretched and cheeks swollen with happiness. I woke up like that, my face straining to smile. Thank you all.
Does anybody have any questions for Michael?
I'd be happy to answer if you have any.
Okay, we have as a tradition, Michael, students bring gifts, as you brought us gifts here this evening. So we've got a little gift bag here for you to take home with you. Yes, so thank you to those students that brought that. And then as also part of the tradition, members of class and anybody else that would like to, we head to the sports center and have an iced tea or a little hummus plate, I guess. So if you're interested, anybody can come down to the sports center downtown Yakima. Let's have another round of applause. If you're interested in having your book signed, Michael will be sitting right up here. There are books for sale over here, both way out there. And the book that I spoke about during the lecture from Woodworks Press, Rose Hip, Plum Cherry, and there's a book, Michael has a book of poems coming out called To Curve.
To Curve.
To Curve, and when is that coming out?
Long time.
Okay, so look for To Curve and come up and get a book if you want. Thank you very much. If my students can help put the tables back, that'd be great. Thank you.